All right. Thank you, Beckett, for the introduction. And I just wanted to once again reiterate, I'm Jason Pro, and I lead our intelligent automation practice within public service. Can't tell you how excited I am to be here today, and especially talking about both intelligent automation and actually establishing and managing a digital workforce. What I wanted to do first was probably take 5 to 10 minutes to just kind of level set on what is intelligent automation, but I think more importantly, talk about some of the key opportunities and key considerations that need to be made when deploying an intelligent workforce. So if you bear with me, we'll go through 5 to 10 minutes of presentation, then I'll transition into a panel discussion where we'll dive deeper into those considerations with folks that have actually lived this in the real world. So while we get this going here, intelligent automation is really made up of two components. It's made up of advances in process automation technology and specifically a capability that's referred to as robotic process automation. Robotic process automation is essentially a software capability that has been designed to mimic human behavior for the purpose of automating administrative tasks. So what does that mean, right? It's a software, and it's a software that's been designed to mimic human behavior. It's designed to interact with systems through the user interface. It has a login, it has a password, it has security credentials, and it's designed to facilitate the movement of information from one system to the next. RPA provides a tremendous amount of opportunity when it comes to improving the accuracy and compliance of processes. It has tremendous opportunity when it comes to cost avoidance and cost reduction as it relates specifically to administrative tasks. That said, there are some limitations to RPA. It does very well with high volume, repetitive tasks and deals very well with structured data and logic-based data. So the second component of intelligent automation is artificial intelligence, right? And artificial intelligence interacts with robotic process automation for the purpose of understanding the interaction with humans in natural language. It understands and learns from the interactions that are being made and has the ability to reason and learn. The combination of robotic process automation and artificial intelligence really presents a wealth of opportunity. What we call at IBM is it really starts to take you down the path from basic automation into intelligent automation. Said differently, the application of the capabilities starts to enable and open up endless potential to move from simply automating administrative tasks for the purpose of cost avoidance, cost reduction, or improved accuracy, but really moving you down the continuum towards mission enablement, starting with freeing up resources to do more mission-oriented tasks. But in the federal sector, or in the federal market, there is great opportunity to apply this technology to the unique mission that the federal government has. Start thinking about speeding the passing of information to the operators. Start thinking about how do we improve the speed on which we move in and out of different operations regardless of what those operations may be. What I want to do here quickly is just transition into some key considerations. I think if you were here for Mark Fisk's panel before around blockchain, I think you're going to see a lot of the similar tasks and principles and considerations that were mentioned by Mark, but they're important to realize. The first is about getting started, right? All of the best practices in deploying intelligent automation solutions talk about understanding and prototyping with intent, but then also taking it and scaling from there. You know, within the federal government, sometimes that can be a challenging task due to federal acquisition rules and that. And so, but really the importance of getting started can't be overstated. It's a critical success factor when deploying these technologies. And when I talk about considerations, you know, to me it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to spend $250,000 working through an acquisition process to fund a $100,000 prototype. And so talking through what are those innovations to enable us to get on contract and work together collectively in some sort of a joint scenario to demonstrate the proof of value is something that's very important. The second thing here is prototype with intent. We don't want to be prototyping for the sake of prototyping. We want to be prototyping with an eye towards how would we take this to production. The idea of getting started is only important when you're talking about it from scale. Yes, it's important to understand and learn from doing prototypes or proof of concepts. But when you start to get to the point where you've kind of demonstrated that value, you want to be able to then transition into production level capability in a scalable way. The last thing here is what we have termed employ with freedom of choice. There are a lot of considerations that need to be made when deploying these type of technologies. What kind of software products do you want to use from an RPA perspective? Do you actually need to employ artificial intelligence with it? But I think more importantly is when you start to look about bringing this into production level capability, you really need to start taking into consideration things like total cost of ownership. What does that model look like in terms of operating and managing a digital workforce? I'll just end by saying that deploying these type of capabilities is not as simple or as typical as deploying a traditional transactional system. There are some very specific considerations that need to be given to these capabilities, and we like to talk about managing the digital workforce is very similar to managing the physical workforce. You have to understand performance, you have to do a little bit of care and feeding for that workforce, and you have to be monitoring the impact that workforce is having on the overarching organization. So with that, I just wanted to provide a little bit of background. I do want to now call up our panel, which will help kind of dig into these considerations a little bit further. First, I'd like to call up Avi Bender, who's the Director of IT of the National Technology Information System under the Department of Commerce. I'll also call up Ed Burrows, who is a special advisor to the Chief Financial Officer at GSA and has been leading GSA's efforts around robotic process automation within their Financial Services Center. And thirdly, I'd like to call up Mike McGeehan, who is with Blue Prism, a robotic process automation product, who has been leading the efforts to take those capabilities into the federal market. So gentlemen, thank you for joining me here. Like I said, I'm excited to be here, one, about the topic, but then two, to also kind of put some of this into reality. So Avi, I think maybe what we do is start with you and have you talk a little bit about the kind of special mission of NCIS and what you are doing to help the government kind of employ these type of innovations.
Sure. So NCIS is a bureau within the Department of Commerce, quite unique because we have authority by law to enter into private sector partnerships with many of the vendors out there. It's a fee-for-service organization with the sole mission of helping federal agencies leverage data as a strategic asset to help them achieve mission requirements, business outcome, and becoming much more effective and efficient in how they serve citizens. You will want to know specifically, like, kind of show me specifically what are you doing. The previous panel that was here, it was a discussion with OPM, David Vargas, and Mike Fisk. So NCIS was the organization that actually enabled that specific opportunity. And I'll get into this a little bit later because the value proposition that we provide is that innovation is not a commodity. Innovation is not something that can be acquired through the FAR. Innovation requires a different approach within the federal government. But it's not enough to say that because of all the structural issues. So by this authority that we have come up with a unique approach of how to facilitate innovation, how to have agencies try new things, such as blockchain, throughout the federal government. And I can get into some of the details a little bit later on. But that's kind of a quick shot of what we're doing.
Okay, great. Ed, I was also very happy to have you be able to join the panel because I know that you've been kind of knee-deep in the GSA's efforts to prototype robotic process automation and couldn't think of a more appropriate person to actually talk about what does this look like in reality.
Thank you.
Yeah,
the timing is very good for me today to talk about process robotics because within the next couple of days, our first robot will be live. We haven't been at it very long. We started in January. And I want to talk about some of the lessons learned, just four in particular. One of them is executive sponsorship and having a very strong champion. It seems like an obvious point, but you can't really overstate the importance because you have to bring the organization together behind this. In our case, our CFO set a very aggressive target of 100 days to go live with the automation. And typically with any robot, that would be aggressive, but this was our first time. We had to design and create the environment. So it was a very, very challenging goal. And the second lesson learned had to do with the way you identify your process candidates, assess them, select them, and prioritize them. That's very important. One of the things we noticed was the criteria that Jason put up are very straightforward. Everyone can understand the process has to be rule-based, lots of labor hours, reduce cycle time, improve accuracy. Everyone understands that. What people don't think about right away is what could you do with a robot that you cannot do today because you don't have the resources or the capacity. So people have to think creatively. If you have any type of data reconciliation process, you don't have to do a sample anymore, you can do 100%. Ideas like that. The third thing is how important it is to have a very good partnership with your IT organization, which we were fortunate to have that. As those of you in government know, this requires authority to operate, which can be a very, very tedious and long process. We were able to get that in a couple of months. And it was important that the IT organization were open-minded about this. You often hear it said, well, RPA is just like, treated just like an employee for security purposes, for credentialing. But that's really an oversimplification because you have to step back and think about what it is and design your requirements around that. And our IT organization did that. They came up with 22 specific questions. And these weren't the usual type of questions you'd have for an ATO. They were tailored to RPA. We were able to answer those questions and get our approval. So strong relationship with IT is very important. Another thing they helped us do was create a two-phase process where we could start going live without a enterprise-wide solution that was fully robust, but it was secure enough to get started and start ramping up. The fourth lesson learned is how we manage the operation going forward. It's very important to have a governance structure in place. Justin Herman mentioned that. We do have a governance board. It's chaired by our Chief Technology Officer. We have the business units participating in that. We have a federated structure where our CIO is responsible for the platform and operations, and our business units identify the processes, prioritize them, document them. So it works well from that regard. But as soon as you go live with your first bot, you have to think about contingencies. So you have to have someone backing up who knows the code if the person who developed it isn't available. In our case, IT isn't doing that yet. So we have our developers being trained within OCFO, and we'll have them do it in teams. So there'll always be multiple people who know the code and can step in. So it's things like that to think about as you manage this operation going forward.
Yeah, thank you. So I do want to give Mike a chance to speak. Sure. Let me get this on here. So Mike, as I mentioned, is with Blue Prism, which is a robotic process automation product, one of the leading RPA products. And I thought he would bring a lot of great perspective to this space, especially since Blue Prism really had made a mark in the commercial sector. And I want to talk about his experience as he has been trying to learn from those lessons, but then also help bring the product into the federal government.
Yeah, no, thanks, Jason, and thanks to everyone. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. So as Jason mentioned, Blue Prism, we're a robotic process automation software vendor. Have been in the market. We're actually responsible and accredited for coining the term robotic process automation. So we've been an industry leader for years in this space. And as Jason mentioned, we're embarking on the journey here in the public sector as we're seeing more and more interest. But globally, Blue Prism has over 700 installs, right? So with that comes a lot of best practices and learnings that we're seeing. Some are very similar as we engage and interact with the public sector, and then some are different, obviously, for some of the reasons Jason had mentioned. The mission is very different, right? So we're seeing a lot of similarities, but yet with some key differences. And as Ed had mentioned, some of the, the governance and the structure is very important as you look at, kind of going from a prototype, with a purpose into production, and then ultimately scaling. So that's Blue Prism's focus in terms of enterprise-grade software. We refer to our capabilities as digital workers, and working with partners like IBM, integrating Watson. Now we're talking about intelligent digital workers and providing them more capability. So we think obviously this conference is geared towards a lot of those conversations and some of the emerging technologies and a lot of opportunities here to collaborate in the public sector. So thanks.
Right. Yeah. Thanks, Avi. You had mentioned a little bit earlier about some of the work that you were doing to enable the blockchain proof of concept and prototype. Can you talk about some of the lessons learned or challenges that were associated with getting that off the ground?
Yeah, I mean, the key lessons learned is that there are lots of structural barriers to doing business with the government. I spent half of my career in the private sector, actually a portion of my time with IBM and other organizations, and selling to the government and now buying, right, and helping organizations actually acquire services. And as I mentioned before, it's very difficult to acquire a lot of these innovative technologies that you hear about, AI, blockchains, and so forth. But one of the things that we have built into our joint venture authority by law that we have is a new operating model. And I'm going to share with you right now what the secret sauce is. And the secret sauce is we offer something in Washington, D.C., which is actually very unique. And that's called a conversation. And what I mean by that is we partner with 31 private sector organizations. And the thing that we are able to do is not so much sell a solution to the agency with the partner, but we meet with agency to understand, what are you trying to do? Now, typically what happens in the federal government is, I have a problem, I'll do an industry day, I'll put together an RFI, I'll get some SMEs, I'll do an RFP, on and on and on, and then maybe a year or 2 years goes by and nothing has been accomplished. What we do is basically meet with the agency, put together a 2 or 3 page problem statement. We have a roundtable discussion before any acquisition about, what are you trying to do? We refine the problem statement, and only then do we begin to execute and find the solution. So, for example, Dave Vargas, we met with Dave to talk about some of the issues that he had, and in the course of the conversation, it became apparent that, in fact, the technology most appropriate for what he was trying to do is blockchain. But in working with Health and Human Services, Office of Inspector General, predictive analytics, other tools are being used. The VA OIG, other tools. The FDA, in fact, is working with us on blockchain and other capabilities. So the key lesson learned is you really need to understand what problem are you trying to solve, not to do it by yourself within the confines of the agency, but engage the private sector in the definition of the problem statement, as opposed to the government saying, we got this figured out, deliver, and then we're not happy with it.
Yeah. Thanks, Avi. I mean, that's great perspective, especially going back to some of the points that I made in terms of kind of critical success factors of deploying intelligent automation. You have to really understand what is the problem that you're trying to solve, what is the process that you're trying to automate, and for what reason. And that's really critical in terms of not just being successful, right, but being able to demonstrate the value to the end user, the value to the organization that's being created by some of these automations. So Ed, I think you touched on an interesting point, and I'd love to maybe hear a little bit more about it. But you talked about kind of the impact to the workforce, but kind of from a talent perspective, needing to make sure that you have the skills available to step in and do development if necessary. You talked about the interaction with the IT organization. I'm sure there was a partner that was helping you as well. Can you just talk about a little bit of the impact to kind of the workforce and then also the skills required to make this successful?
That's right. Regarding IT, I think the important thing is you don't need a large resource commitment from your IT organization. You just need a couple of people who are dedicated to it and willing to work with you and think creatively. That's all we had, and that was sufficient. The other point about talent within the organization, we asked everyone in the CFO organization, which is over 600 people, if anyone was interested in learning to develop RPA applications. And we gave them a very brief overview of what it was. And 50 people volunteered. They were very interested in doing this on a part-time basis. So then we went to the managers and said, here is the people who have volunteered. Can you please select which you think would be best, have the best skill set? And they nominated 14 people. And those 14 are in training this week. So they originally did online training. Now they're doing a week of classroom training. And they're very enthusiastic. But we're still debating the best way to do this, whether the advantage of having people across the organization, even though they're part-time, is they generate enthusiasm. But the model of having a centralized group of specialists is also a good model. So we're going to play it by ear as we go along.
Great. Maybe just one more follow-on question as you're kind of working through this. I've talked to a lot of people about the application, the operation and management of this capability, and I always get a little bit of a funny look when I tell them that there is some care and feeding that is required on the robots. Can you maybe talk a little bit about that with your experience? Maybe around when interfaces change or when there are new upgrades to your software. What are some of the things that you need to do to kind of get ahead of that and go ahead and manage that proactively?
The key point there is to have what we call a bot steward. So you have one person responsible for that, making sure that it's running correctly, looking at audit logs, looking at the output, checking, also keeping tabs on any changes to the systems. So if it's logging into a system and the screen changes, we have to know about that in advance. And the person would actually modify it and then release the new version at the same time that your core system is changing. So that is well coordinated. But I think you have to have that level of responsibility. One-to-one relationship, having a person responsible for each bot.
Yeah, great, thank you. Mike, maybe back over to you as well. Just with all of the experience that Blue Prism has had in the commercial side of the house, can you talk about some of the kind of traditional use cases of robotic process automation and how maybe some of those use cases are different based on the mission of the federal government?
Sure. So I think, not unlike the government, the private sector, obviously most of them are starting out with similar types of use cases. Those are focused on, finance and HR and some of the onboarding, whether that be in the supply chain or the procurement area. They generally gravitate to where there's a lot of people in process. As Jason described, that's where, an RPA sweet spot is. As we kind of transition and look at the public sector, I think there's a lot kind of starting in that area, and I think there's certainly a lot of room to grow, as I mentioned before. I think the mission really, changes in the way that you kind of look at this digital workforce and deploy this digital workforce, right? So we talk about it with the view of a what we call a triple win, right? Which is essentially, I think a lot of organizations privately look and say, well, what's the ROI around this? And that's an important metric, right? But this triple win is, value back to in the parlance of the government, the agency and the mission, right? So how is this going to impact that and the value there? The value to the citizens, right, which is really important, and a kind of a citizen-centric approach, and the value that this technology brings there. And then equally as important, and in my opinion, maybe most important, is the value to the employees as they look at this and interact with this technology, and how they're afforded the opportunity to maybe offload some of their work in this mundane, repetitive tasks, and have an opportunity to look at other more cognitive type of base work and the reality around that. So we kind of look at it from that triple win perspective, and a lot of organizations are successful there as they develop their critical success factors and dive in with that triple win kind of view.
Great, thanks. Avi, I think another question for you is, where do you see both your organization going with regard to the services and offerings that you make available to commerce and the federal government, and then also just around like other transactional authorities? Do you see this as something that's going to continue to grow for the purpose of enabling kind of emerging technology?
I think the other transaction authorities, the joint venture partnership that we have, are ideally suited for incubating innovation because it's quick time to market, time to value, employs an agile development process, reduces risk for the agency. They can pull in and out. There are no protests involved. This is done outside the FAR, right, and so forth. And I think just one other comment that I would add is that I meet with lots of federal agencies, and regardless of what the agency is, I find that they're actually pretty similar. Every agency, regardless of whether they know it or not, have a supply chain. They produce products and services for citizens. The way they do that is from a data-centric perspective, they collect data, they process the data, they disseminate, they analyze the data. And truly understanding the data flow in the supply chain are the key ways for optimizing operations within the federal government. So what the trends that we're seeing is that, sure, I think AI, blockchain, machine learning, many of these technologies are fundamental to transforming the underlying supply chain. And if you don't understand the supply chain, then you're actually applying IT modernization and innovating at the margins, right? So you really need to get down to the core of the business. And to be able to do that, you need various other acquisition vehicles to make that happen. And I think, as you mentioned, the OTAs, the joint venture authority that we have, other mechanisms, all really need to be explored.
Great, thanks, Avi. And for you all at GSA, have you seen value in deploying the first bot, and do you intend to kind of continue to go down this path?
Definitely. Our first one required approximately 100 man-hours per month. And now the person who operated that process simply goes into the environment, kicks off the bot, it takes a minute, and he's done.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
So there's definitely value there. And we have several other candidates lined up that have similar labor savings.
Yep. Great, thanks, Ed. I think, Mike, just from a product perspective, where is kind of Blue Prism looking to take its product as you kind of continue to evolve?
Yeah, so our co-founder's vision is really this intelligent digital worker, right? So it's embedding skills that are very analogous to the human worker, and this vision of a digital workforce sitting side by a human workforce. So leveraging AI, ML, and some of the emerging technologies, right? And really creating those efficiencies and driving that forward. So. There's a lot of innovation going on, and quite frankly, a lot of that is driven by our customer base, right? As we grow and as we develop, our partners and others are really helping to drive that innovation as to what agencies and the commercial entities need.
Great.
be successful.
Thanks, Mike. So we have about 30 seconds left. I want to thank the panelists for coming up here. I provided some really great insight into kind of the reality of some of the challenges and opportunity that we have with this type of technology. I think the last thing I'd leave you with is there's always a lot of conversation around, is this designed to eliminate the workforce? And I think in the federal government, the reality couldn't be much different, right? It's really about augmenting that workforce for the purpose of better enabling mission, whether that's through improved compliance, improved accuracy, or improved productivity. And so I like to always talk about it a little bit different, especially when it applies to public sector organizations. So thank you.